Philosophers, good day to you. Here we begin reading the very end of Descartes' Discourse on Method, part 6, where we see the culmination of his second goal for philosophy. Remember, back in part 1, when Descartes was reflecting on his education, he said that he ultimately sought usefulness and certainty, or we actually give him the other word, but certainty and usefulness in all of his understanding of things, right? And we saw the culmination of certainty in and fundamentally getting to the foundation of I think, therefore I am. And now we'll see the foundation of usefulness will be in the ideas of the laws of nature, that the fact that these laws of nature exist and are knowable by human beings. And we'll see here in part 6 really what use will put that knowledge of the laws of nature, right? Based on what we can know about the nature of reality itself, what can we do with that knowledge? That's what we're going to see here in part 6 in the fundamental concept of the mastery of nature, right? So we'll see in this video where we'll simply describe what Descartes means by the mastery of nature, and then we'll see in following videos, which were actually recorded years ago, and I'm going to reuse here, are some videos that describe the moral imperative towards this mastery of nature. So let's reflect for a second, right? Let's reflect, right? What would life be like without technology? And when we think of technology, what do we think of if we said that we got rid of technology? I would argue in some ways we almost make the word modern equivalent to the word technology. When I use the word modern, I almost think of technology because that's what sort of makes our modern lives so modern. And most important thing that I think of first when I think of technology, I think of my cell phone, right? I think of this computer that I'm using to record on. But what would life be like without technology? Now, if those are the only things we think of when we think of technology, we're thinking of too little. Right? Technology is much more grand than that, right? Where I live around plenty of farms, and there's plenty of Amish and Mennonite folks around me. In fact, there's a nice family that I go to buy eggs from every couple of weeks, especially now the way things are. And and you might wonder, well, if we want to know what life would be like without technology, can we just look and see what the Amish folks are doing? I'd argue no, they still have plenty of technology, right? What are the limits of what technology really is? Well, if you think about it, even like this pen is technology. And this is a pretty fancy pen. I mean, this pen has got like springs and all kinds of stuff, and technology certainly went into building it. But even a lead pencil is technology. One could argue that even this piece of wood, and actually I cut some pieces of wood to prop up some of my books and computers and stuff to get a little bit of height here, but one could argue that even this could, in some sense, be technology. I might say, like, how is a piece of wood technology? Well, as soon as I start putting it to use. Really, if you think of what it would look like for a human being to be without any technology at all, it would be like a human standing alone, naked in the woods, right? Not having any tool to put to use. And so what is technology? One could say technology is anything that we use to expand human capabilities or to improve human capabilities. So for instance, I'm able to see, but some type of technology could allow me to see further, right? So that would take a capability that I have and improve it, right? But I could expand it. There's things that I can only do because of technology. Like for instance, I can fly. Well, not literally, but I could fly in a plane, and technology makes something like that possible. And so technology would be anything like this. And so if we had no technology, it would be like we had nothing at all. So we can't underestimate technology in some ways because we as humans are very poorly equipped, right? We don't have much natural weapons here. All we have is our reason and opposable thumbs. And our reason and our opposable thumbs seems to get us pretty far, right? Descartes and actually one of his contemporaries, Francis Bacon, and if this was an expanded course, we would have another week or so where we read Francis Bacon, who's a really interesting early modern philosopher. But both of these philosophers have this notion of the mastery of nature. And what do we mean by this notion? Well, they both recognize that we are subjects to nature, right? That when we look at how our lives are, they are fairly pessimistic, and they recognize that human life is marked by suffering and death. I think as Americans, we're very unaware of our own mortality. I would argue that even right now, in the midst of this pandemic, when all of us are hunkered down at home and things like that, I feel like even now many of us are very unaware of our own mortality. But I don't know. I can't speak for you. But a lot of us tend to assume that our lives are just going to continue on forever. We're not really afraid of death. Maybe some of us are, maybe some of us aren't. I don't know. I can't speak to it. But I feel like in America we haven't had this sense of the impending nature of our own death. Right. But if you go to other parts of the world, people are. And if you just go a little bit further back in history, we are aware of this. And probably today we're definitely I would say we're more aware than we were even than months ago, one would think. But if we're constantly subject to the worry that could come from all of the way that we live our life being basically completely changed and snuffed out. Right. And so there's an interesting story that Francis Bacon, again, we're not reading Francis Bacon, has a story called The New Atlantis. And the New Atlantis is supposed to be contrasted to this old classic story of Atlantis. And you've probably heard the story of Atlantis. In the story of Atlantis, there's this city that is on an island, and it's incredibly... it has incredible progress, right? This city is technologically advanced, it's culturally advanced, and is actually set up to sort of conquer the world until basically overnight a storm comes and destroys the city. The island sinks into the ocean. There's still some people today and that wonder if maybe Atlantis was a real place, and people go searching for it. Interestingly enough, one of the first places we encounter the story of Atlantis is in Plato. Plato tells the story of Atlantis. Francis Bacon tells a new story of Atlantis, where it's a new city, a new island. I don't want to spoil the whole thing. You can read it. It's in the book called The New Atlantis. But there, Francis Bacon talks about a new island city that has excellent culture, excellent society, but has not just become powerful politically, but become powerful scientifically. Powerful so that it has developed technologies that allow it to no longer be living in fear of the impending doom that can occur by nature at any moment. So it might even reflect, a perfectly good person, a virtuous person, at any moment could suffer death, right? And a good and virtuous society could at any moment be destroyed. We're constantly on the brink of destruction, right? And so for Francis Bacon and for René Descartes, as we'll see here in part 6 of the Discourse, they say that this new idea of nature will allow us to no longer have to live in fear, but allow us to use our knowledge to change our relationship to nature itself, to no longer simply be subject to nature, but to be masters of nature. Okay, so let's read the text. We're not going to actually read Francis Bacon here, but we will read some Descartes, right? So if we turn to page 35 in our books, right? So turn to page 35 in our books. And all this time, I've been putting over here on the side. I hope you've noticed that I've been sticking page numbers and things like that. So you should hopefully be reading along and taking notes with us as we go through here. But here we see Descartes first mention the mastery of nature. And he says, for these notions made me see it as possible to arrive at knowledge that would be very useful in life, and that in place of that speculative philosophy taught in the schools, it's possible to find a practical philosophy, by means of which, knowing the force and the actions of fire, water, air, the stars, the heavens, and all other of the bodies that surround us, just as distinctly as we know the various just as distinctly as we know the various skills of our craftsmen, we might be able in the same way to use them for all the purposes for which they are appropriate, and thus render ourselves, as it were, masters and possessors of nature. And I want us to focus on that phrase, masters and possessors of nature, right? Descartes actually is in some ways appealing to even an old biblical idea here, where in the story of Genesis, how humans are sort of placed as being caretakers of nature itself, but in a special place, that we are in nature, but that we are in charge of nature to some extent, that we possess it, right? But Descartes says that we're going to become masters and possessors of nature not by some type of divine gift. We'll become masters and possessors of nature by understanding nature well enough, understanding fire, water, air, all of these things, just as a craftsman understands his craft, just as a carpenter understands the wood that he builds with, right? And it's from these from this knowledge that we'll be able to take our understanding of nature and we'll be able to use it for all the purposes that are appropriate. And what are the appropriate uses of it? Well, Descartes doesn't articulate this, but arguably whatever it is that we need to do, right? That we will become masters, that we'll understand nature so well that we can change our place in nature, that we can change our capabilities and change the causes of our suffering. So let's continue reading, right? So what can we do? What does he mean? What is he trying to tell people in the 1600s about what we can do if we can understand nature? Well, he says here, he describes first, like why are we going to master nature? First, this is desirable not only for the invention of an infinity of devices that would enable one to enjoy trouble-free the fruits of the earth and all the goods found there, right? So notice, it's not only for an infinity of devices. You might say, well, why is that all that important? Well, notice that Descartes says it's not only for an infinity of devices. How many is an infinity? Infinity is a lot. Infinity is, some people say infinity is the biggest number. Infinity is not the biggest number, because then there could always be a number infinity plus one. Infinity is in fact not a number at all. Infinity is describing something that goes on and on and on without end, endless. So when Descartes says there's an infinity of devices, there's an endlessness to the number of devices that and tools that we could create that would change the way that we sit here in the world, right? There's an endless number of things that we can make that would enable us, as he says, to enjoy trouble-free the fruits of the earth and all the goods found there. But that's not the fundamental thing, right? He says, and if we continue, but also principally for the maintenance of health, which is unquestionably the first good and the foundation of all the other goods of this life. For even the mind depends so greatly on the temperament and on the disposition of the organs of the body, that if it is possible to find some means to render men generally more wise and more adroit than they have been up to now, I believe that one should look for it in medicine, right? So Descartes says health, right? Health first and foremost, because if you're dead, there's nothing for you to enjoy. Your virtue can't help you if you're dead. Well, unless, there's an afterlife. But notice Descartes here, as much as he's talked about the existence of God, and as much as he's tried to prove that God exists and that God's all perfect and all good and all these things, Descartes actually regularly undermines the stature of God here in the Discourse on Method. At first, it sounds like Descartes is just trying to appeal to God as being sort of this, all good savior for us. But instead, Descartes is not appealing to God to save us from nature. Descartes says God already made nature. God already made the way the world is. It's now up to us. We are going to become more godlike. And Descartes, in even doing this, almost sounds like he's making us better than God. Because God created the world in a world that we're going to suffer. Descartes seems to be suggesting here that we can eliminate the sources of our suffering, right? We can eliminate death, right? Number one, we should seek health, right? So we should seek the end of disease and all that. That's not a shocker, right? And we're going to do it through our own power, right? And notice, though, that he doesn't just mention here health. And there's two notions of health, if you really think about it. There's some. If this class was longer, there's some extra additional readings that we can reflect on what health is. But my wife is a nurse, and I know lots of people in healthcare. But what does a doctor do in making someone healthy? Health is fundamentally first just sort of returning people to their original state, right? Like my son Dominic, he broke his arm. He got a cast, he got some treatment, and through the healing process of his body and through the good work of some doctors, his arm was restored to its previous state. He could use it the way he could have used it before. So health, on one hand, is by returning us to a previous state. But there's another notion of health here. And notice here that Descartes doesn't just talk about returning us to a previous state. He talks about improving us, right? He says, if it's possible to find some means to render men generally more wise and more adroit. He says that somehow, even through medicine, we could improve the human being and improve the most important things about us, right? Our wisdom and our ability to adroitness has to do with our ability to get things done, right? What we can do, we can improve ourselves through medicine, right? Continuing here, Descartes reflects, and actually all the same stuff here, right? He says, it's true that the medicine currently practiced contains few things whose usefulness is so noteworthy, but without intending to ridicule it, I am sure there is no one, not even among those who make a profession of it, that would not admit that everything known in medicine is practically nothing in comparison with what remains to be known. Does that sound familiar? I feel like that's a general idea that we have about medicine, right? When I hear about people talk about cancer research or even this COVID virus, it's presumed, it's inevitable that humans will come up with a cure, right? And I think the COVID-19 coronavirus is not so complicated. Right now it's April 2020. There's no cure. Perhaps when you're watching this video, maybe there is a cure, and this is just a distant memory, right? So we take it as inevitable that we'll come up with some type of vaccine so that we won't have to deal with it. But even more extreme things like AIDS and cancer and things like that, we have some kind of treatments, but people are still looking for the cure. And there's sort of this notion of the inevitability of these cures, that they will absolutely happen. And that everything that we know today is nothing in comparison to what we already will, what we will know. That it's inevitable that we can attain this kind of knowledge, right? And so when Descartes reflects on this thing, he ultimately reflects on one of the reasons that he writes this book. He says, why do I ultimately write this book? Well, I write this book to help you figure out how to have certainty in your life. But also, he would argue even more importantly, I'm writing this book so that you know this fact about nature, that we can know nature, and because we can know nature, we can change nature. And so he wants us to now take him up on this and to take up that task. So Descartes in the 1600s, this is one of the reasons why Descartes is considered a modern philosopher, that Descartes in the 1600s is setting out the new goal of science. Up until now, the goal of science has been essentially for the sake of knowing for its own sake, just trying to seek to understand. But now we're going to see with Descartes a new sense of the goals of science. The goal of science, the goal of knowing, is to master nature, to know enough about nature that you can master it. There's some very deep, interesting issues with that we're not going to completely explore here, and how that presupposition that our knowledge should should be useful for us can actually maybe cover up certain aspects of the truth. But this is this new fundamental idea. And actually, I meant to put this in big words, and maybe I will, and I'll edit this in. But have you ever heard this phrase before? Knowledge is power. You wonder where that came from? It came from Francis Bacon, but also Descartes here. And when Francis Bacon and Descartes talk about the mastery of nature, what they're saying is knowledge is power. That the knowledge is only knowledge if it makes us powerful. And that there's a kind of knowledge that's possible that would make us extraordinarily powerful. And what we need to do is to grab that possibility, right? We need to develop this. We need to give it sufficient work and funding. And that's all we need, right? It's a little more complicated than that. And you know that. It says, for having the intention of spending my entire life in the search for so indispensable a science, and having found a path that seems to me such that by following it, one ought infallibly to find this science, unless one is prevented from doing so by either the brevity of life or by lack of experiments. And so here really, this is where we see Descartes saying it's inevitable, right? I judge there to be no better remedy against these two obstacles than to communicate faithfully to the public the entirety of what little I had found, and to urge good minds to try to advance beyond this by contributing each according to his inclination and ability, right, to the experiments that must be performed, and also by communicating to the public everything they might learn, in order that with subsequent inquirers beginning where their predecessors had left off, and thus joining together their lives and labors of many, we might all advance together much further than a single individual could do on his own. Now, just here's a funny thing. Remember in part 2 of the discourse when Descartes said that the most perfect thing would be something that's made by an individual rather than a group? Here Descartes says you actually couldn't do this alone. But notice that this task for Descartes is going to be different than others. He's calling all of human community to try to seek the mastery of nature. And he says, but he will say now that we have almost become like children with full use of our reason. Descartes has set up for us the goal. set up for the idea of the mathematical status of nature, right? And the idea of experiments, right? If you keep reading, and we're not going to read these texts here together, but if you keep reading, you'll see how Descartes describes ultimately describes. Why am I'm drawing a blank? What does he describe? Oh, he describes experiments and how experiments are necessary for us to be able to achieve the things that we want, right? But this becomes sort of the new way we seek the human good for Descartes, right? That we need to develop the mastery of nature, and it becomes the fundamental moral principle. Such a fundamental moral principle that it governs our lives. It governs our politics. It governs the way in which we relate to the world. If we look at even our own politicians who try to communicate how we can seek happiness, we're not going to, as we'll talk about, we're not going to seek happiness necessarily through virtue. We're going to seek happiness through the development of science, which will overcome our weaknesses in the world. So let's continue on. In the next video, we'll explore this moral imperative to the mastery of nature. Have a beautiful day, and catch you on the flip side.